A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show. My name is Matt Wingard, and I am the Horrible Deplorable. And as always, with me is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
So we want to welcome the Gab community. We created this podcast specifically for that Gab community. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and Stitcher and Pocket Cast. Did you hear me say that we're on iTunes now? So that's very exciting. And I would like you to do me a favor. If you're listening to this show and you are enjoying it, would you please take a moment and write a review in whatever app you are using to listen to this podcast or whatever program. Usually there's an ability to give it a ranking and to do a review, and that will help us with the search engines if you give us a review and tell us what you think, and we'd like to read that anyway. So please do that and share us with your friends. We need to grow. Okay, so the big story, there's real news in the world, but the big story this week was this absolute meltdown at CNN and the mainstream press over Donald Trump, the greatest president ever in the history of the United States. He put out this tweet that was somebody else's GIF, that was a little short piece of film, if you will, that went back to his WWE day. He made some appearance on WWE and he body slammed Vince McMahon. And somebody had taken that little bit and put CNN's logo over Vince McMahon's face, and so it looked like Trump was body slamming CNN. It was amusing. All of us who love Trump thought it was funny. Anybody who remotely had a sense of humor would have found that funny. But instead of reacting like a normal person, CNN had a complete meltdown with the help of course, the mainstream media. And the immediate reaction was that he was inciting violence against journalists. And that now if any journalist gets hurt, it's going to be because Trump egged people on to do that. And then, to make matters even worse for themselves, CNN decided that they were going to find out who created this GIF originally. I mean, who cares? But they decided they were going to hunt this person down. So this big, massive media organization found the original creator of this thing on Reddit, some poor schmo who had some anonymous account. And I guess he'd posted some things at CNN and some people might have thought were anti-Semitic. And so he, in fear for his life, completely folded when CNN contacted him and issued an apology and went on, sort of castigating himself and wearing the hair shirt and everything. And then CNN published the story and withheld his name, but made it very clear at the end that they were only withholding his name because he had apologized and that they reserved the right to change their mind if his behavior didn't change. Well, everyone in the sane world reacted to that. What is this major media organization doing crushing some average American for coming up with a GIF, a little funny meme, essentially? And in exercising this power, they looked horrible. And they've gotten a lot of pushback as a result of it, and they've deserved every bit of it. And I think whatever shreds of CNN's credibility existed pretty much evaporated, and you got to believe Trump's just enjoying the heck out of that whole thing, because it's just like watching your opponents get so angry with you that they angrily take out a can of gasoline and pour it all over their head and light themselves on fire, yelling, "I'll show you." That's basically what I see when all this happens.
So you know what came out of this? Alex Jones from InfoWars has announced a great CNN meme war contest, which is offering a $20,000 reward for the best meme. Did CNN not understand that they have started a war with the hacker universe?
It was interesting. Somebody calls that the autistic community, the hacker community. And they said, you don't really want to pick a fight with the autistic community. It's kind of funny. I mean, it's extremely funny that CNN would do this to themselves. And of course, now there are thousands and thousands of memes out there that show people getting body slammed or run over or hit by a car or having a door or falling into a garbage can or whatever. And they all have CNN's logo on it. So, for a powerful media company to be that tone deaf, and also to not even understand the sort of lay of the land of how social media works and what would happen if they decided to pick this fight, is just the height of stupidity. But it's the arrogance that our elites have. I want to talk a little bit about these Trump tweets, though, and there's a lot of pressure from never-Trumpers and leftists and all the elites who hated him from the beginning to try to get him to stop tweeting. But of course, he should not ever stop doing that, ever. It got me thinking about why it works and why it makes them so angry. And, the left and the mainstream media are all waxing nostalgic about George W. Bush now. And it's clear that they want him back. And why do they want him back? Because he would just take it. Because he was of that old school, the perfumed hanky crowd that believed that you kept your nobility and you raised your nose and you just kind of kept your head above it all, and you didn't dignify what the press was doing with a response while they dug your grave. And it's happened. We've watched it happen to Republicans that we care about for decades. It's not like the other Republicans come to their aid. And when you get isolated like that by yourself, you're pretty easy to destroy. Now, Trump has proven to be such a juggernaut that they could not do that to him. But for most of the last few decades, as we've watched, the sort of isolating one Republican from the herd and then destroying them has been a pretty tried and true tactic of the left. So, of course, they hated George W. Bush when he was president. Each Republican president, I say, has to wait. They have to wait patiently until the next Republican gets elected, because that Republican president will be the new source of absolute hate from the left, and they will then begin enjoying their strange new respect, which is all the nostalgia calls back to why can't this Republican be like the last Republican? So, of course, W got all this. When they were hating on him, it was always like, why couldn't he be like Reagan, who they hated when he was in office? And now that it's Trump, they're like, why can't he be like Bush, who they hated when he was in office? So it's just this very easy to identify cycle that we go through all the time with the left. One of the reasons why I think his tweets work, and it's clearly purposeful, because he tends to do these really dramatic tweets that are offensive to the left on a Thursday or Friday. And he knows he's going into the weekend where the talk shows, the weekend talk shows, the Press the Meats and all the others are going to be hammering away at him. And if he tweets something that they find offensive, then that's what they'll be talking about. And he can essentially dictate the terms of the conversation for the weekend and make them hyperventilate rather than pounding away on him. For instance, if the healthcare thing is kind of stumbling and they're not getting a lot of progress and the Republicans have had to delay the vote for a week, that's all the Sunday shows are going to talk about. But Trump tweets this GIF and suddenly that's all they're talking about, and healthcare gets pushed off of the top of the agenda. So he's fully aware of the news cycles, especially the weekly news cycles, and how they love to hammer away at Republicans in every negative way. And by getting them focused on him, he's almost taking one for the team, right? He gets all their focus and their ire aimed at him while Republicans continue to work out their problems, which we can talk about as well. The other thing that the tweets do, and I think people are missing this, is that it reinforces his outsider status. One thing that always happens to politicians when they run as outsiders is that after they've been serving for a while in D.C., they begin to appear as if they've been captured, and people no longer think of them as outsiders, and it becomes very difficult to run, especially when you run for re-election as a president, to run as an outsider. But by doing these tweets that constantly aggravate the left and the elite media, and they do him a great favor by reacting in such a way as to reinforce that he's an outsider. I mean, they'll talk about how what he's doing is not presidential. That's perfect. If you want to maintain this idea that you're the outsider that was brought in to attack the swamp, then you want the press to keep reminding people that you're not one of them, that you don't belong, that you're not presidential, that you're an outsider. So in every way that they hyperventilate and that they attack him over these tweets, they reinforce to the public that he doesn't belong there. Now, they think that's a negative. Like, he's not acting presidential. He doesn't belong here. But to the rank and file American voter, it reinforces that he doesn't belong there, right? That's a positive thing, that he's an outsider and that he's come to deal with them. They absolutely do not understand how much they are despised. That is at its core of the mistake here, is our elites have not figured out how deep the loathing is for them. And this is the celebrities in Hollywood, this is the press, this is, CEOs. All of the people that make up our elite cadre in this country are, to a person, almost entirely despised by a large swath of the American public. And they don't see that. And because they don't see that, they continue to react to Trump in a way like, don't you agree with us that what he's doing is X, some form of a negative condemnation? But most people don't want to side with the elites. They don't really feel sorry for them. And that's one of the other things that Trump does very well, is he follows some basic rules. He only attacks those with power or those who have a platform. Even when they thought they had him because he attacked the Kahn family, they had basically gone to the Democratic convention and used the Democratic platform to attack Trump. And everybody understood that that was political. And he pushed back. Trump doesn't just pick random people in the country to ridicule or to push back on. He pushes back on the powerful. And the powerful think that somehow we're going to side with them when he does that. The press especially likes to think that they are somehow of the people. But most of the people don't see the press as of them anymore. And they just fail to see it. And that's why they don't understand why it's working for Trump and why it's going to continue to work for Trump. Also, I think that some of this is that Trump exudes this kind of confidence, self-confidence, that we really have always admired in this country, but has come into disrepute on the left. The last half century or so has seen sort of the revenge of the nerds, if you will. The people who felt like they were the outcasts in high school have really gone to work on that sort of John Wayne archetype. This personality that used to appear in all sorts of famous Americans that we really celebrated as a culture, the confident male who understood who he was and didn't take crap from anybody and stood up for himself and wasn't constantly saying on the one hand and then on the other hand, or being mealy-mouthed or constantly trying to be PC. And I think a lot of these folks who so basically hate that jock from high school who used to give them swirlies, they think that they have made that sort of self-confidence and that swagger a complete negative in our culture. But it's not. And Trump in some ways embodies that, and he is giving the press daily swirlies.
Well, I believe the majority of the public is tired of placing political correctness above common sense. And furthermore, the demonization of Trump by calling him and his supporters Nazis, the Klan, white supremacists, fascists, etc., works very well in entrenching Trump supporters to his side.
It's true. It might seem, to some people, it might seem that his tweets or his attacks are infantile. But I think our distaste for their abuse of power, the elite's abuse of power, is so great that it's actually rewarding for most of us to see them being knocked down. And that's what he does. He knocks them down a few pegs. And no one else in our society does that. These people basically, especially members of the DC press corps, think of themselves, we've talked about this before, as if they're the high priests of our society. Never to be ridiculed. Never to get a comeuppance of any kind. It's their job to mete that out to others in society, but never to take it themselves. And Trump almost entirely knocks down people who never get knocked down. And the rest of us love it, and of course they hate it. It makes them just spitting nails mad. By the way, if you are disconnected from the mainstream media, which we highly advise. That's part of the reason why we offer the news feed on Gab and on Twitter that we do, so that you don't have to see all the hoaxing and the crap and the hyperventilating and the bias that's in the mainstream media. If you have unplugged from that, I highly advise that you never go back. Do not dip your toe back into that pool at all, because if you've checked out from this hyperventilating for any amount of time and then you check back in even for 10 seconds, you would be shocked at what you see on these channels. They are unbearable and unbearably smug and condescending on these stations, and it's not good for your blood pressure to return to them. So if you've cut the cord, keep it cut. Watching these journalists acting the way they do, I started out life as a journalist. I was a television journalist in a small market. I mostly got out because the pay sucked, but I got into journalism as sort of it was kind of a little bit by accident. I'd gone to school I wanted to study film, and film school was difficult to get into, and so I ended up sort of halfway through my college career going into journalism school. And I got my degree in that, and it was fascinating, and I enjoyed the years that I spent in it. But I tell you all that to explain that I did not come to journalism the way most people came to journalism, and it only took me a very short period of time in the industry to understand who I was surrounded by. Most journalists decided when they were about 8 or 10 years old that they wanted to be journalists. And that's all they ever wanted to do. I mean, I heard this from practically everybody I worked with. And so they were willing to take low pay and bad working conditions because they could not imagine themselves doing any other job for a living. I just didn't feel the same, so I didn't last for as long. But a lot of them see this, there's this motto among journalists, this unspoken motto of, our job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And they really do see it as a mission. People get into journalism because, whether they would admit it out loud or not, they're thinking, I can help change the world. It's the same reason why somebody would go into the Peace Corps or join a nonprofit. And it's no different than people get involved in politics. They really believe that it's their job to have an effect. Now, many, many decades ago, journalism was much more of a trade than a mission. A lot of the people who were journalists did not have college degrees, and it was really seen as more of a journeyman trade type of job. There was a lot of hard drinkers in the business back then too. But in a way, journalism was mostly stenography. You went and you watched what happened and you took down what people said, and then you came back and you reported that. And you typed it all out, and then you went home or went to the bar to drink. And so it wasn't considered something, it was a trade, it was a skill, but it wasn't necessarily something that was considered to be very hard to do. And it was a bit like factory work. It could be a little bit rote, just kind of covering the same type of thing over and over again and cranking out the stories. But as a lot of college-educated folks came into journalism in the last 50 years, they weren't interested in just being stenographers. They would have not lasted very long if they thought that's all it was going to be. They wanted to use the power that journalism had to shape opinions and to steer people in the direction that they wanted them to go. And that essentially is how journalism has been completely devoured by this idea. And it's different. And you have to see that and most people do, recognize it for the kind of open, biased, yellow journalism that it is today.
Well, CNN's brand began to collapse when this left-wing network became even more strident and nakedly transparent in its crusade to personally destroy Donald Trump, all in an effort to make Hillary Clinton president. CNN's rating and viewership continue to fall.
I want to talk about the elites again. A lot of other countries deal with what they think are class struggles, and I think there are real class struggles, especially in places like India. And England certainly had it for a long time, and to some extent it's still there. But the United States doesn't really have class struggles the way that other older societies do. And when I talk about our elites, I'm not talking about a class, economic class in that sense. It is much more of a club. And the best analogy that I can think of is to think about wherever you live, think about where the sort of elite neighborhood is. Where's the wealthy neighborhood in your state? Or if you live in a major metropolitan city, there's probably some neighborhood that's sort of where the wealthy tend to live. So down in Los Angeles, it would be Beverly Hills, for instance, or Malibu. Now, anybody can move into those neighborhoods, but they're not all part of that neighborhood. There may be apartment buildings in those neighborhoods, and so some people may move in so their kids can go to those schools, but do they ever really get accepted into that neighborhood? No, they do not. And you know, there are people in those neighborhoods who've had money for a long time, and they may have owned the home in that neighborhood for a long time, and then every month there are more people buying old homes and moving in, people who've never lived there before, the sort of new money. So this idea that it's a blue blood thing or that you have to come from money in order to belong is wrong. Anybody can work themselves into that neighborhood. So you do have to have a certain amount of money to move in, or if you move in and say take an apartment or you're renting out a basement or something in that neighborhood, you still have to find a way to belong. And to belong means to accept a certain set of notions. There are always these sort of conventional wisdoms, things that the neighborhood believes, and some key people in the neighborhood who sort of decide what the neighborhood believes. And if you want to belong, then you agree with those things. And if you want quickly to get ostracized, even though you may still live in the neighborhood, you will be ostracized if you actively work against those conventional wisdoms, whatever the accepted things are in the neighborhood that everybody's sort of, it could be around protecting the school, or it could be around, I know some of these neighborhoods where people are expected to donate to the school foundation, and people come door to door looking for a donation. And believe me, they take note of who doesn't make the donation to the school. And that's a great way to be sort of considered on the outside. And I use this analogy to simply give you an idea that being an elite in this country is more about being in that club. You can go to Harvard and Yale, and that's a great entryway into that club. But if you go to Harvard and Yale and you say the wrong things, and you do the wrong things and you take the wrong positions, you will never really be a part of that club. And that's really who our elites are in this country. I also want to explain the swamp in D.C. and how the web that an outsider like Donald Trump walks into. And I want to use John McCain as an example of how a swamp creature is created over time and how their power grows. So McCain comes to Congress basically around 1980. He serves a few years in the House side, I believe, and then becomes a senator. And he's been a senator from Arizona ever since. And again, I'm just using him as an example. I happen not to like him, but think of this repeating itself over and over again among a lot of others. The longer John McCain stays there, the more powerful he grows. And it's not just because he has seniority in the Senate. He has a staff of 40 or 50 people in that Senate, usually young people coming out of some of the best colleges. A lot of them, some of them may even have law degrees. And they come to work for him, and they work in his press office, or they work in his policy shop. And after a few years, they then usually rotate out. They go and find some job. When a Republican is elected, there's all sorts of administration jobs that are then available, and most of the senators will supply their staff members for these key positions. And then when the Republican is no longer in the White House, they go and find other work in think tanks, or they go and work for various associations. But they stay in this D.C. milieu. So think about a guy like McCain and the hundreds and hundreds of young people who started out in his office, and then they move out to the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, so that by the time it's 2017, and John McCain's been a senator for 40 years practically, there are literally hundreds of key people all over Washington, D.C. who are loyal to him because he gave them their first break in D.C., and they cut their teeth on politics with him, and they have stayed in touch with him. And he's probably helped them advance along the way to various jobs. You know, when they're out in some job and then they want another job, they would probably go to their former employer, the senator from Arizona, to ask for a recommendation or to make a discreet call to encourage their hiring. And that's how a never-Trumper like McCain can make life very difficult for a guy like Trump when he comes to D.C., because McCain has all sorts of people who are leaking him inside information from all of these executive agencies to let him know what's going on. Now, on top of that, McCain was involved in the Abscam scandal, which is a banking-related scandal, very early on, and got burned, and I think decided very early on that he was going to curry favor with the media so that he wouldn't be their whipping boy for his entire time in D.C. So I guarantee you there are half dozen or a dozen key reporters in Washington, D.C. who rely on John McCain for information constantly. And that's how he keeps them and their papers from being too brutal on him. And he sells out Republicans because that's the information that would be most valuable. He's going to have information on what's going on behind the scenes among Republicans. He's not going to have information as much about what's going on behind the scenes for Democrats. And they have their own sources among the Democrats. What they need from a Republican source like McCain is what is the kind of things going on behind closed doors that they don't get to see or hear. And he does that to curry favor. After 35, 40 years in D.C., this is an enormously powerful swamp creature. And again, I use McCain as an example because I loathe him, but there are dozens and dozens of other, think of the Charles Schumers of the world and everyone else who've been there a long time, and they have these entrenched networks to help them. And all of them are at work trying to sabotage and undermine the greatest president of the United States, Donald Trump. So when we think about the swamp that he walks into, and when we think about the just avalanches of bad press that are constantly flowing on him every day, it's entirely made up. It's entirely manufactured by not only Democrats and self-starting media types who just loathe Trump and want to work him over, but lots of never-Trump Republicans are feeding that mill that wants to hate on him every day as well. There are these fiefdoms and webs of loyalty. It's very similar. I've been reading recently about the Roman Republic, and one of the things Rome was very famous for was clients. A lot of well-to-do patrician Roman senators had clients all over both the Italian peninsula and then even out in the various holdings that the Roman Empire controlled. And these were basically local wealthy people or local movers, but they owed their loyalty to one particular Roman and his family, and they were considered clients, and they would not only feed money but information about what was going on in that area back to the Roman senator. So this is nothing new. It's as old as the hills, and it's important to be aware of how it's operating. So I saw the other day this Drudge headline that said, NBC News decries rise of conservative media for creating polarized country. And I looked at that headline and I thought, yeah, well, that's actually true. It is a polarized country. And it's only polarized, though, and we're going to get back to what we've talked about before. It's only polarized because the right is fighting now. They want to be able to be as nasty as they've always been, which is how they've gotten their way for decades and decades. And they expect us to roll over and compromise and to be defeated and to fight nobly so we won't use their tactics. When we fight back using their tactics, it's nasty. No doubt it's nasty. It's basically a quadrupling of the nasty because it's their regular nasty and our nastiness back. But when they decry this, they don't really want to stop fighting. They want us to stop fighting. And I'm going to say what I said again, which is that if it's not polarized, if there isn't this sense of uncomfort, if it doesn't feel nasty to you out there, then we're being sold out. Because the other side never stops fighting. They never stop fighting. So if it seems quiet, if you don't hear shells, exploding in the distance, then it means our side has called a ceasefire. They never do. That is just a myth, this idea that we're going to come to some kumbaya moment and have this peaceful return to a bygone era. It's not going to happen. It can't, folks, because of who we're dealing with, who will never allow us to achieve our goals. It's either surrender or we defeat them. Those are the only two choices. So when NBC decries the polarized country, I say yay. It means we're finally fighting. That's what they're really mad about, is that we are finally fighting. So I've used this term in a previous podcast, the cloud cities. And I promised that I would explain this, and Doris has heard me use this before, and so I do want to explain it and define it. This idea of the cloud cities comes from an old original Star Trek episode with William Shatner, the best of the best. There was an episode called The Cloud Minders. And basically the plot of this episode was that there were, on this planet that the Enterprise visits, there are basically two groups of people. The miners who live on the planet, although they live below the surface mining all the time, and the people who live in the cities which float on the clouds. They're using some kind of technology to have these cities that look like giant flying saucers, essentially, with skyscrapers on them. And they float out up in the air, so they're way, way up high above the surface of the planet. And the people who live up in the cloud cities, they're just artisans and philosophers, and I'm sure they just make love all day and eat, and they just basically exist because all of the energy that makes their society work comes from what's mined in the mines down below. And the miners down there, that's all their job is just to mine. Now, as you can imagine, they're not really happy about that, and the people in the clouds, the way the plot unfolds, the people in the cloud cities think they can't live with the miners because the miners are very violent, and it turns out it's exposure to the dust down there that makes them as violent as they are, and so Kirk has to broker this compromise. But I've never forgotten the image of this idea of the people who live up in the clouds and have no idea how anything that really matters as far as existing, they have no idea how any of that actually works. They're only interested in the high arts and the pleasures of the world, because it's all being taken care of for them, out of sight and out of mind, by other people who don't have such a nice existence. And I have come to believe that that is precisely what is happening in the modern world. The people who live in our urban centers, they don't know how any of that works. They have no idea how those skyscrapers got built or how to build them. They don't know how the water gets treated, both before they drink it and after they flush it away. They have absolutely no idea how the electricity is generated and how that grid system works to bring all that electricity in their homes that makes all their devices and their phones and their electric cars and everything else work. And they're simply interested in the pleasures of life. And it's the farmers and the miners and the construction workers and the truckers that are supposed to keep everything working, keep the food flowing, the electricity flowing, the water flowing, and they'll just enjoy it. Meanwhile, of course, they look down their nose at all of these people who actually make the world work. And that's what we have. We have these cloud cities now. The miners down below, if you will, in this scenario, the people who I just listed, they're the crucial ones. And yet they're mistreated and sneered at. So the people in the cloud cities are entirely dependent. And they're entirely self-centered. And that's why I call them the cloud people. You'll hear me call them the cloud people or the cloud cities. For them and their lives, symbolism is more important than reality. Because they don't have to deal with reality. Reality is taken care of by others. And they can deal in symbolism. And that's why you see, I think it helps to explain a lot of the street theater that you see in the urban centers as well, because it's all about symbolism for them and not reality. Think of it this way. The people in the urban centers are the fantasy voters, and the people outside of the urban centers are the reality voters, or the liberals and the conservatives. The liberals, the fantasy voters, live in the cloud cities. They don't know how anything works. So they concentrate on the way that they wish the world was, right? They're artists remaking the world. The conservatives, the reality voters, live out where you have to actually make stuff happen, or they're paid to actually make stuff happen. And they understand how hard that is. And they understand that certain things have to happen. You know, they get that there are trade-offs and sacrifices that have to be made. that the coal must be mined in order for the energy to be produced. I would say that the liberal moral philosophy can be summed up in two very famous sources from the last 50 years. One is something that was originally said by George Bernard Shaw, and then it was sort of restated by John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert, and then stated again by John Kennedy in the 1980, it might have been the 1976 Democrat Convention. And the quote is, "Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not." That is the fantasy voter, not the reality voter. The other great cultural symbol of these fantasy voters is John Lennon's song Imagine. It's actually a nice tune. The lyrics are abhorrent. But it's the kind of song that when you're young and naive and you hear it, it sounds wonderful. The sentiment sounds absolutely wonderful. But as you grow older and you begin to understand the way the world really works, there's something very grotesque about the lyrics to Imagine. And I'm going to read them just so you have an idea of what I'm talking about. And see if you don't immediately recognize the fantasy voter. So the lyrics are, "Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. And no religion too. Imagine all the people living in peace. You may say, I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. And someday I hope you'll join us. And the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. And I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one." Is that not the same thing as "Some men see things as they are and say why? I dream things that never were and say why not?" By the way, that source on that, George Bernard Shaw, was a very well-known Fabian socialist and one of the original, most famous socialists in world history. Now ask yourself, after I've explained these things, whether an increase in the population of the cloud cities, which is what's happening, is going to produce more reality-based voters or more fantasy-based voters. Now, I'm not suggesting that idea of trying to make a better future is an entirely bad thing. I would never suggest that we should all be 100% reality-based and that there should be no dreaming or any wish or desire to improve the world. I'm simply suggesting that there's a mix between those two ideologies that's probably better than one or other in its purest form. And I'm suggesting that the mix is probably way out of balance because as more and more people are living in these cloud cities and more people are becoming fantasy voters, we don't have enough of the reality ingredient to make the right mix.
So let's talk about North Korea since it's so much in the news. Should we be afraid of this? What should we be doing about it? And so I asked Matt, if you were president, what would you be doing right now?
Well, I think the president is not being subtle in communicating sentiments that I agree with, which is that China is entirely capable of doing something about this. North Korea is China's creature. When the Soviets existed and the Chinese were still under Mao, we fought the Korean War and would have won that if the Chinese hadn't intervened on North Korea's side and flooded the zone. We ended up back to the divided country the way the whole thing had started, and it's been a stalemate ever since. And the North Koreans have been bad actors in the region, and the Chinese especially have always enjoyed that because it's a source of irritation to the United States and to South Korea. So this, the family of Uns that have reigned in North Korea are entirely the creatures of China. Now, I'm willing to acknowledge that some of this may have spiraled a little bit out of control for China, but not much. I still think that the vast majority of what happens is not necessarily directed by China, but certainly they're aware of it, and they assent to it by not making it clear that they're against it. North Korea exists because China continues to feed it and to trade with it. 80 to 90% of all of their trade is with China. So if China wanted North Korea to fall, if China wanted a regime change in North Korea, they could achieve that very quickly. And don't believe for a second that the Chinese haven't entirely penetrated North Korea with their spies. So they know everything that's going on in North Korea. And they are very concerned, and have been for a long time, about American influence, military influence in Asia, because they want to dominate. And so they don't like our relationship with Japan. They don't like our relationship with South Korea. They don't like our military presence there. And they've enjoyed for many decades that North Korea sort of acts as a proxy, agitating us constantly.
But what would happen if North Korea decides to turn against China?
I don't think that's even remotely possible. I mean, North Korea might turn against China, but only after China's turned against them. In other words, if China were to really cut them off and were really to move towards regime change, then probably that's when the top of the North Korean government may become very unhappy with China. But again, I suspect that key people in North Korea are loyal to the Chinese, because I believe the Chinese have completely penetrated that society. That is a border country for them. It is a country that they originally propped up and supported. I believe that key generals, key people in that country take their orders from China, or they are sleeper agents for the Chinese. In other words, told to just go along and get along, but if and when the day comes that we activate you and we need you to do something, you're obviously going to do it for us. This is their creature. So Trump is basically taking the tact of, we're not going to allow you to just let this wild dog run loose in the neighborhood anymore. I doubt we'll see a military confrontation. I think that's in absolutely no one's interest, and I think it's unlikely. But the UN Ambassador Nikki Haley has just signaled very strongly at the UN that if you trade with North Korea, we're going to treat you the same. So this really jeopardizes China's economic relationship with the United States. If they're even half serious about this, about beginning to punish the Chinese on trade or their banks because of the relationships they have with the North Koreans, then the Chinese have to make a decision about what's most important. Now, obviously, logically, it would be in their interest to cut the North Koreans loose and maintain their economic ties to the United States. I mean, it's a magnitude of 1 billion times different in comparison. But understand also that the Chinese are proud people, and they have, like a number of Asian cultures, they have this idea of saving face and having face. And they cannot be seen to be capitulating to this kind of a threatening action from the United States. So they will never, if they are going to ratchet down on North Korea, they're never going to do that in a way that makes it look like they did it because we made them do it. That's just, if you know anything about Asian culture, that's just not going to happen. Now, Trump gave them the opportunity to do this on their own, and they made the decision to not do that. So economic sanctions talking about economic sanctions on China are the next step. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Again, I think military action is unlikely, except for things on the margin. We might sink a ship here or there or shoot something down. But, if you're talking about like land force invasions or a real war of any kind, I think that there's almost 0% chance of that happening. But of course, if we do execute any kind of economic sanctions on the Chinese, they're going to reply in kind. And so it is possible for a minor trade war or an escalating trade war to begin to take place. That's why I'm not the President of the United States, and he is the President of the United States. You have to weigh in the balance the pros and cons of each step that you take as you escalate this fight. But the rocket that the North Koreans fired off is generally agreed to have been an ICBM, which could have reached Alaska, or in very short order, the North Koreans will be able to land that in Alaska. Now, have they miniaturized the nuclear warhead to the point where they can put it on a missile like that? They're probably not there yet, but there aren't many steps left. And the point is that their ability to launch a rocket this far is threatening. It's threatening to the population of the United States because it can reach Alaska.
So how would a trade war between China and the U.S. affect the average American citizen?
Well, in a sentence, price increases. Things coming from China would cost more, or they would cost more because they no longer come from China and they have to be sourced somewhere else. Most of what China manufactures that we buy is sort of on the cheap end of goods. So it would be some of the products that we are, I'm not thinking of trinkets. Most people can do without trinkets. When you go into the visitor center of any amusement park or national park, almost all of the little trinket items are made in China. I don't think that's the kind of thing people would notice. But on the lower end of the scale, I mean, a lot of what you see in Walmart is made in China. Toys that don't last very long, games, things like that. And they could go up in price because they aren't necessarily made in China anymore.
Well, maybe that would happen, give us more manufacturing, which is what we need.
One of the benefits, there's so many benefits to the energy independence that the president is achieving for the United States. We are really very shortly about to be completely free of any dependence on Mideast oil. And we're going to be a net exporter of, if we aren't already, a net exporter of energy. This is really, really a crucial development. Not only does it change our politics because we don't have to get involved, friends, we don't have to care as much about what's going on in the Middle East because it's not going to affect our economy because we have the ability to produce our own energy. I mean, it's going to change our foreign policy. And I think you already see that there's room now for an increasing amount of isolationism, although that's a dirty word because we're never really isolationists. The world's too connected for that to make sense in the way that people defined it from before World War II. But essentially, for us to be less involved and to have our power less projected in military bases all over the world, I think that there's room for that. It's created by the energy independence that we have. But there are other side benefits to that, or additional benefits to that. And for instance, if the price of gasoline, if the price of energy is falling, in the average American's budget, that means that the cost of living goes down. That creates some more disposable income. So if certain prices for things in Walmart are going up, if your energy prices are being squeezed, if you don't have somewhere for that to go, that can really affect a person's bottom line, especially poor people in the United States who may be more dependent on and price sensitive to things in Walmart. But if their gasoline price is going way down, they may not in the end really feel an increase in prices at Walmart. So there's cushion in there that's created by this energy independence and by the falling energy prices that the president's policies are creating, so that it gives him leverage to pick a small fight with the Chinese. And, just 10 years ago, we would have been much more price sensitive to issues with China if they occurred. That's just an example. Those are just two examples of the benefits of having basically control of our supply of energy. And no one on the left would have wanted this. I mean, they've been trying to stop mining, and they've been trying to shut down the building of new refineries and coal power plants and the digging of coal and fracking. I mean, everything the left does was designed essentially to make us more dependent on foreign sources of energy, which of course means that we have to project our power out there. So the same left that doesn't want us to do any of these dirty things because of their environmental ethic produces a much more active foreign policy out of the United States. And they'll decry that. No more wars for oil. Well, it's their policies that create a war for oil. Because if we could drill and build refineries and frack and we can do shale oil, then there's no need for a war over oil somewhere else.
And there's less payoff to foreign countries and more money spent at home, which a lot of people in this country support, and one of the many reasons why Donald Trump was elected.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. I want to just change the subject and make a point about the 17th Amendment and federalism. Just another thing to think about as you're watching things unfold. It's been over 100 years now since we passed the 17th Amendment, which was the direct election of senators. This is an amendment people don't even think about anymore, and yet I think it was one of the biggest mistakes we ever made. The 17th Amendment was probably one of the greatest catalysts to ending states' rights and the power of states in the country. It was part of a collection of progressive amendments that had passed at the turn of the last century. And the idea was that senators had become very corrupt. They were nominated they were put in power by the state legislatures. They were not directly elected by the people of the states. And so there was a lot of what people saw as cronyism and backroom deals about who got to be the senator from the state. And that was all considered very bad. I'm sure it was. But ask yourself, since we've had 100 years of direct election of senators, do you feel that D.C. and politics is cleaner than it was back then?
Or represents us better?
Exactly. So in the end, and this goes to my point about term limits and other things, just changing the mechanics of something doesn't change the underlying problem with us. As Shakespeare famously wrote, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. You can't use a gimmick to change what people will ultimately do to batter down constitutional protections. They just do it over time. We're like water. People are like water, and the Constitution's like a rock. They just erode it over time. So the idea behind passing the 17th Amendment has turned out to be completely false. The idea that the third senator from New York or Chuck Schumer or people like John McCain are somehow not as corrupt or not part of machines, are not doing background deals than the guys that were nominated by state legislatures 100 years ago is absurd, and I think everybody understands that now. But what happened at the time was that the states gave away their power because you are beholden to who elects you. And the senators, the senator from Kansas and the senator from Georgia and the senator from Maine were put in their position by the state legislatures. And if they began voting to take away power from the states, well, they're going to be replaced pretty quickly by those state legislatures. But once those senators were elected by the people directly, they didn't necessarily have a strong reason to protect state rights. They had a reason to deliver for their new constituents. Their new constituents were not the states, but the people within the states. And so it didn't take more than a couple of decades before the next depression, the next recession, which became a depression, for FDR and the progressives to move in and to clamor to pass all of these changes that Swiss cheesed the Constitution and empowered the federal government, and a lot of senators went along with it. 30 years before, they would have flatly blocked that because their state legislatures would never have wanted them to do that. But giving away state power and empowering the federal government, well, that suddenly became kind of in a senator's interest because that meant his power as a senator grew, even if it was the expense of the states. So it was not only good for his constituents if they were clamoring for it, but also for himself politically to grow and increase the power of the federal government. There was a reason why those senators were elected. But once again, the wisdom of the founders was just thrown off, and the election of senators by the state legislatures was just cast aside as if it was archaic and useless. And I think we've come to understand now that it was a huge, huge mistake. Combine that with another thing that's happened over the last 100 years. Right about the same time as the 17th Amendment was being passed was the last time the House of Representatives was expanded. It wasn't always 435 members. It was a lot fewer. And they would add to the House when they felt like the individual congressional districts were getting a little too big, because the idea was that a congressman should be able to get out into his or her community and people would know who their congressman was. Well, they stopped 100 years ago, and we haven't increased it from 435 for 100 years. And now the average congressman represents almost 1 million people. Each congressman represents a little under 1 million people. In some places, it would be 1 million if they represent the whole state. Think about that. You have the direct election of senators. They're not elected by the state legislatures. And you have Congress people in what the founders set up to have a close relationship to the people who are voting for them. They now represent 1 million people. They're never going to meet the vast majority of them. And that's why the campaigns are television campaigns. That's why they're massive media campaigns that take a lot of money, because congressmen can't get out and door knock on 1 million doors. Can't do it.
So what's your answer to that?
Well, the answer would obviously be to repeal the 17th Amendment and to think of another way to constitute the House so that, whether you need to expand the size of it or maybe you need to create regional bodies that then elect the House members, maybe some kind of intermediary organization between the two. But you need to give people a federal representative that doesn't represent so many people, because that dilutes the individual. You now have to try to raise your hand and be heard over 1 million other people to get your congressman's attention. 100 years ago, that was not the case. So federalism is decreasing under everything that I've just described. At the same time, obviously, the government is growing. And it's a recipe for the kinds of distrust and dissatisfaction and the kind of broiling anger that's out there. And it's another reason why I believe that civil war is coming. I have no idea what form or shape that's going to take, but this dissatisfaction is real. And a lot of the parts of our constitutional system are breaking down due to age. And the weight, if you think about how big this country is now, and again, that each congressman has to represent 1 million people, and the government is now so big, think of that as a giant weight sitting on a structure that wasn't built to hold that much weight. Something's going to break. So I was watching this television show, Orphan Black, on BBC America. Once again, just out of the blue, about 3 seasons in, a trans character shows up. And I got to thinking that the ubiquitousness of trans characters on television is now so absolute that it's clearly not about diversity. No one's trying to meet some diversity quota. It's just a giant FU to the viewing public. It's like, no matter what show you're watching, we're going to shove a trans character at you. You know why? Because we've got the power to do it. And if you want to watch anything on television, you're going to have to watch something with a trans character.
Yeah, try looking at your next TV program and see if you can pick out the trans character before it becomes too apparent.
So the other thing, Doris and I saw Baby Driver this week. We are not of the same mind on this movie. I didn't dislike Baby Driver. I thought it was fine. I saw a lot of other movies in it, Hudson Hawk and True Romance and that Ryan Gosling movie Drive from a few years ago. But I didn't particularly think I was seeing anything that original, and it was entertaining, and the bar is so low because so much else that's on the screens this summer is just terrible that I would definitely recommend Baby Driver over just about anything else that's out right now. But in a year, I probably won't even be thinking about this movie and probably won't even remember much about it. But Doris had a different reaction, and Doris, you make your case for why Baby Driver is a really good movie.
Baby Driver was an awe-inspiring piece of filmmaking from Edgar Wright, and it plays out as a musical through the lens of an action thriller. Baby is played by Ansel Elgort and has a great supporting cast of Kevin Spacey, John Hamm, and Jamie Foxx. It's sweet, funny, and in contrary to what Matt says, it's utterly original and the best action movie of the summer. Go see it. You won't be disappointed.
Well, there you have it. 2 different opinions on that movie. We're almost at the 6-month anniversary of the presidency, the greatest presidency in American history, and we definitely want to do some reviews on that. So in the next couple of weeks, expect that I'm going to rank the cabinet secretaries. Basically, they're all going to be ranked on a curve against Scott Pruitt at the EPA, who is the one guy who is kicking butt and taking names and trying to accomplish. He's the one who it appears as if he comes to work every day thinking he may only have a week left, because he's constantly trying to get as much done. He sees the clock ticking down, and he understands you have a limited amount of time there, and he is trying to get a lot done. Not everyone in Trump's cabinet is doing that, and we're going to rank them coming up. And also, we're going to rank the president on the 5 or 10 basic issues that he ran on for the presidency. How's he doing after 6 months? So stay tuned. That's coming up in future episodes. Remember again that we are on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Pocket Cast. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow. So please like our show and review it on whatever app or program you're using to listen to the show, and share it with your friends. You are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.